Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, finally back with another One Piece at a Time talking head video. Sorry it's been a little while since I posted, but I haven't been getting any questions, or at least none I've seen. I've got one here that I'm going to get into today. It's a really good one, but as always, if you want me to keep making videos and keep sending me questions, please. I love helping distillers of all types in any way that I can, whether they be home distillers or professional distillers. That's what this channel exists for, is to help you guys in any way that I can. I don't know everything about the art of distillation by far. I learn more every day. I forget more every day. But this channel helps keep me on my toes, and I think it's helped some of you people out over time. Also, I can't tell from my camera because there's a little bit of a glare. Hopefully I don't have no pawpaw sitting in my beard. It's pawpaw season. I picked up a bunch of them this evening and ate 2 of them, and have a tendency to end up with them all over me. There's probably some on my shirt, whatever. It is what it is. I'm just a Southern Hoosier hellbilly, for whatever that's worth. But anyways, quick update too. If you have ghosts, you have everything podcast. For those of you into the paranormal, spirituality, high strangeness, the 4TN, mythology, folklore, all that stuff, it's about to start up its new season. So we'll be doing a regular season, and I'll probably do some spooky season episodes like I always do in October, based on fairy tales and things of that nature. As time, allows for me to record those things and get them out there and edit them. It takes a lot of time to record and edit a podcast. Like if you have ghosts, you have everything. The narration, finding the stories, doing the research, even the interviews, going through and editing, adding music, etc. But it's a passion project for me. The way that I'm minded for me in life, art and music and life and spirituality, religion, magic, daily things that you do, they're not separate. They're all part of one thing. The Egyptians thought of it as Heka, is what they called it, and that's very much a style of life that I live. So for me, all of those things are very, very closely interrelated, which brings me over to the Practical Distillers and Alchemist Almanac for 2026. It is at the printers right now. So don't think it started printing yet. They have to do a review, they have to do the setup and all of that stuff. That should be done anytime now, and then that will go directly into print. As soon as that is printed and it's shipped to us, it'll be out there available for you guys to order. It's a pretty lengthy volume this year. I put a lot of work into it. I really doubled down on the astrology part of things. The traditional farmers' almanacs and the old farmers' almanacs, etc., they all have a several page sections, just the astrology, right? And it's the stuff that sort of repeats every year, like the rules and stuff like that, but then the dates change and all that sort of stuff. So I really doubled down on that this year to come up with the format that I want it to have in coming years, which knocks like 20 or 30 pages out of me having to do every year, so I can focus on other things in that almanac. But there's some great stuff in there. I'm incredibly proud of it. Out of everything I've ever done in my career, and I do mean everything, I am more proud of the Practical Distillers and Alchemist Almanac than I am of anything else, because it fills a void where nothing existed, right? It's an almanac for people that are into astrology, people that are into folklore, people that are into magic, and it's an almanac for distillers. And alchemy is the great-grandmother of distillation, or the great-grandfather. I don't care which way you want to look at it. Maybe a little bit of both. A little Hermes Trismegistus there, right? Anyways, be on the lookout for that. All that money, supports me, supports my family, and supports future almanacs or other books and things like that I'm working on. I do have some other things that I am working on. I intend to publish a lot more in the future, as expanding a part of my career, basically. But anyways, if you have questions about the art of distillation, reach out to me. Or if you have a ghost story or folklore or spirituality stuff you'd like to talk about on If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything, you can also reach out to me. bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. You can reach out to me via social media, or you can reach out to me in the YouTube comments below. And as always, please keep the distillation questions coming so I can keep the videos rolling for you guys. So let's get into this. So hey Alan, excuse me. Hey Alan, been listening to you for a while, but first time reaching out. Really appreciate everything you do for the community. Working on some apple brandy to fill a bad mo, and I'd like to run a few things by you to get your perspective. I've made apple cider for years and brandies the last few years, apple, grape, and persimmon. If you ever get a chance to make persimmon brandy, do it. Real quick aside on that, I've made persimmon brandy before, and I've had many persimmon brandies. I have yet to find one that has thoroughly impressed me. Now, persimmon liqueurs and persimmon cordials I really like, but persimmon brandy, there's just not a whole lot going on there that's not a little funky and tannic, and I get it. I think it would be a good base for an almost neutral spirit, so take it up like 170 or so, where there's just a little bit of that coming across still. I think there could be some interesting things there, especially as a tincture base, you know, here in the local area, or places where persimmons grow. That what a great base alcohol to work with that Mother Nature has provided to you to forage and do something with. Anyways, also they used to make a lot of persimmon brandy over in Switzerland County, Indiana, in the early 1800s, but mostly because it was so freely available. It was everywhere over there, so they used what they had, right? So this year I decided to make apple brandy fermented on the fruit, as per your recommendation, but it started turning to vinegar before fully dry. The fruit formed a thick cap. I stirred it down every day or two to keep it wet, but this also continued to introduce oxygen. I thought the active ferment would throw enough CO2 to keep bugs at bay. Fruit picked from friends' orchards, no drops, crushed with an apple grinder, chunkier than applesauce. We were going to press some too, but my friend's bladder press wasn't working. Added 2.5 to 3 gallons of free run juice. Other than that, it was straight from the grinder into the fermenter. 45 gallons or so in total. It got cut off. I can't tell how many gallons you got here. So 32-ish gallons in a 42-gallon fermenter with lid. 3 4-gallon fermenters and 5-gallon buckets with lids. Didn't measure OG. This fruit's usually about 1.05. That's about right usually. Native yeast kicked off fast. Apples are ripe here when it's still hot. I tried keeping the primary fermenter cool with a fan and wet towel around the fermenter. Fermenter was mostly between 67 to 75 degrees, more on the high side than the low side. Would have preferred cooler. 4 days into ferment it was 1.042. At 18 days it was 1.008. At 20 days, I opened one of the buckets and it smelled strongly of vinegar. I ran it the same day, but it was too late. I got 6 ounces or so of low ABV low wines. The other 2 buckets in the main fermenter had varying degrees of much milder vinegar smell. Main fermenter was now at 1.006. Ran everything over the course of 2 days, working in 10-gallon batches in my 15-gallon thumper and steam stripping. Yield was low. If it was just juice, I'm not sure how to interpret my yield with on-fruit fermentation. When ABV off the spout was less than 10%, the low wines was in the low 20s. I started collecting 10% to 5% separately so as not to further lower my low wines ABV. I collected 6.5 gallons at 21.5 and 1.25 gallons at 8%. If it was juice fermented dry and no vinegar, I would have expected nearly 10 gallons at 28 to 29%. This is way longer than I intended. Here are my questions. Any suggestions to keep on-fruit fermentations from turning to vinegar? I'm tempted to rerun the 1.25 gallons 8% at 8% to increase ABV and add back to the low wines to slightly increase ABV. Any reason not to? Haven't done a spirit run before with this low of ABV low wines. Should I be concerned about my barrel entry proof? How does on-fruit fermentation affect yield? I went into this thinking I'd get a higher yield, as that's what tends to happen with on-grain ferments. Perhaps as a result of the grinder not breaking down cell walls like pressing or freezing would. So, all great questions. Great experiment as well. I will give you my take on it in a few different ways. So, typically, apple mash brandies, as I've talked about on the channel before, I prefer to cook those apples. I prefer to freeze them and cook them if I have room for them, but I prefer to cook them. You can do them cold, and I've done it cold many times, and cold was very common here in southern Indiana in the Black Forest region, right, where we made apple mash brandy. That's what we did. The ABV, as you know, just like with juice, is never going to be very high, right? And sometimes if you're using wild yeast, you're definitely going to invite some vinegar in, right? And then the trick is, okay, so you have low ABV and you know you're going to get some vinegar. Where is it worthwhile or not worthwhile for you to decide to go ahead and run so the vinegar doesn't go any further, right? So I would say if you're in a situation where you're not able to keep things cool, like you're not doing this in the late fall, where you're going into the winter time and it's going to stay cool, maybe even stall out over the winter, kick back up in the spring, or you don't have a cellar or something like that where you can keep it extremely cool, not extremely cool, but 65 to 70 roughly, you have to make that call of, okay, I'm going to run it now. And as I mentioned many times about fruit brandies, even American fruit brandies of the past, fruit brandies across Europe, etc., a little VA is not a bad thing. It's part of the characteristic. If I had a Palinka, for example, or a Slivovitsia that didn't have a little VA to it, I wouldn't consider it a Palinka or a Slivovitsia. And the same is true of apple mash brandies. Now, that said, you don't want that VA to eat all of your alcohol, which you experienced. So again, you have to make that determination, right? And so at a 75-degree fermentation, for example, I probably would look at this, and I've done this at Old Homestead because I have to, you know, with wooden barrels with no cooling for fermentation. If we're setting it coming up on 12 days, 14 days, and she's still setting it like 1.008, we're running it, right? Yield is what it is, we're running it. We know that yield's going to be low, and we know we're going to have lower proof stuff, but we also know we're going to have a lot of flavors come across because that lower proof and because we're pulling more water across, etc. So there is a qualitative benefit to that. Me personally, the way that I've come to enjoy doing this the most is to, as I said, freeze and then cook those apples. So I basically make them into an applesauce, and then I cook them. Or sometimes I don't even make them in applesauce. Sometimes I just slice them and cook them in water and let them just fall apart, because they'll fall apart once they're cooked. If at all possible, I like to freeze them ahead of time. But of course, that cooking process is going to do two things. It's going to sterilize everything, as you know, just like with a grain. But it's also going to kill that wild yeast. So if I want to use that wild yeast, I'll either go ahead and culture one of the apples ahead of time and get a yeast culture up and going, or I'll set a few apples aside to start a yeast culture off of. After everything cools down, I can pitch that back in. If you're going to do this as a cold style fermentation, I feel like it works best as a cold style fermentation if you are bumping with sugar or honey or maple syrup or something like that, where you're getting your ABV up. Yeast kicks a little bit harder. There's some nutrient of some kind in there that it can eat on, right? Maybe even some barley in there, whatever you want to do, just to get that yeast working a little faster and get it to work through it, you know. And then that's where we get into the tricks of the trade that I've talked about, of, you know, making your low wines, or even making your high wines, or your double pot still, or your reflux stuff, then soaking some apples, redistilling, or redistilling with some apples in a gin basket, or even soaking on apple chips, right? Those are just some other potential things that can be done. They don't have to be done, though, right? I would not expect for the original gravity to be very high, just like it wouldn't be with apple juice. You know, you're talking 1045 to 1055, somewhere in there at best. And that's with the apples very well pulverized and very well integrated into the water, into the matrix. I would say, in order to avoid the vinegar, we just addressed that, I would rerun the 1.25 gallons that you have to increase the ABV and add it back to the low wines. There's no reason not to. Just remember, the more you distill apple, the more flavor that you do lose. But again, there's ways to make up for that, right? You're adding it. You could add it even back into another apple cider mash, or apple cider, or a fruit mash if you wanted to, and rerun it and pull some more flavor that way and some more alcohol that way. But I see no reason not to run it. Now, I will tell you that a lot of the old school fruit distillers, even here in the Black Forest region, the few moonshiners that were around when I was a little younger that were still doing this, they wouldn't do that, right? They would see that as taking more of the flavor out, and even if the yield was a little lower and the proof was a little lower on the finished distillate, they would take that over top of trying to bump that. But I don't see anything wrong with it one way or the other. There's a million ways to fix this, to make it better, to make it more intense, and to make it more interesting. So I see nothing wrong with that. Haven't done a spirit run before this low of ABV low one. Should I be concerned about my barrel entry proof? I wouldn't be. So, you know, I've done very low ABV peach brandies, very low ABV apple brandies in the past, to the extent that on double pot still distillation, I might be pulling off at like 115 to 120. For our gin project at Old Homestead, for example, we did an orange juice brandy, which orange juice, as you can imagine, is kind of hard to ferment. And so we had some stalls and stuff like that happen. And so our proof off of the pot double thumper system was 114. But because of that orange aroma was just tremendous, just absolutely tremendous. And it held up through a fourth distillation, technically, if you count the pot double thumper, and then it went into another still for gin. It held up to all those gin botanicals beautifully. I would say as long as you're not getting down below 105 proof, you're good. Let it ride, let it run. You know, I always keep my brandies at whatever proof they wore off the still, because I'm trying to hold on to as much of that raw material character and flavor and aroma as what I can. How does on-fruit fermentation affect yield? I went into this thinking I'd get a higher yield, as this is what tends to happen with on-grain ferments, perhaps as a result of the grinder not breaking down cell walls like pressing or freezing would. So, it depends. So the question is, did you run the fruit in the still? If you ran the fruit in the still, your yield definitely should have been up compared to normal. If you didn't run the fruit in the still and then you didn't press that fruit out and get all the liquid out of it, just like with grain, you're not going to get as much yield out of it. You also don't have as much going into it. You're not able to get all the alcohol out of the raw material, etc. I don't see, when I do the cooking method or the freezing method or a combination of the two, even with just apples and water and no sugar, no honey, no whatever, no chaptalization, right? I don't see a big difference in yield between doing it this way and doing it based on juice, essentially. So the apple mash brandy is a stylistic choice. It was a regional style. It makes a very specific style of brandy. Very big, very heavy bodied, very bold, much more akin to bourbon than Calvados, for example. Doesn't mean that it's the only way or the best way to do it, but the little tips and tricks I've dropped in this video should help you, right? And so if your ABV is low and you have those low wines, my recommendation would be, if you can find good apples, again, do the cooking method. Take them apples, slice them up, put them in the water, cook it until it falls apart, right? When you go to ferment that, like I said, you need to either start a starter separately off of, some apples that are set aside, or set some apples aside to get a starter off of later. And this can be as simple as literally just, sometimes I'll just set an apple aside, and when I get done and everything's cooled down, I'll pitch the whole apple, right? The yeast is all on the skin. I'll use it like a yeast log. I'll pitch that whole apple and let that yeast get up and going. I wouldn't let it go at 75 degrees for more than 10, 12, maybe 14 days at the most, and that's a long fermentation if you're not adding any sugar. But I would distill that mash with those low wines that you have. Consider all of that your low wines, and then either I would redistill as is, double pot run basically, or I might go double pot, and I might then take that finished spirit and macerate some dried apples in it and call it good. Or I might take those low wines and macerate some dried apples in those, and then maybe even add some dried apples to a gin basket and redistill that. That'll up your flavor, that'll up your aroma, your yield will come up some, you'll be able to rectify what you had previously, right? It's kind of the best of both worlds, and that gives you a chance to experiment with the apple mash methodology, essentially. I hope I'm explaining all that right, because I feel like that was a train wreck, and I think it's just because I haven't done videos for a couple weeks. So anyways, man, great set of questions. Absolutely great set of questions. And don't be afraid of a little VA. As I said, a little VA in a Hoosier style apple mash brandy is completely a part of the characteristics, right? Not so much that you notice it when you're smelling it or you're drinking it, right? But if you're akin to it and you know what it is and you smell it, you're like, okay, I know what that is. And then that contrast comes through, right? It's the same reason that a shrub works for a cocktail. All things to consider, man. But and also, there's nothing that says that you have to use the wild yeast, right? It is entirely possible that where you harvested these apples at, you may not have a strain of alcohol-tolerant yeast. Now, typically, a lot of the times on fruit, the yeast that is there and is native is a very strong decomposer and is usually alcohol-tolerant. But it is possible that you may have just not got a great yeast strain from the wild, and it's also possible to adapt that strain. So maybe get some of that yeast and start some very small, like half-gallon mashes, and start building it up, right? Get a little stronger. Get one started, let it get going. When it gets ready to fizz out, start a new one off that same, starter. Let it get going, start a new one once it starts to fizz out, until you see that it's going dry, and it's going dry quick, right? With no sugar added and at 75 degrees, you should be through your fermentation, even with a wild yeast. 5 to 6 days is about where you should fall. So at 75 degrees. Now, if you drop in the 60s, it's going to take a little longer. Anyways, I think I covered all the bases, but guys, I appreciate you. Send me your questions. Love y'all. Later.